The winter winds of 1327 carried more than snow across the English countryside. They whispered of rebellion, of a king who had forgotten his throne for the warmth of another man's embrace, and of a queen whose patience had finally shattered like ice beneath a hammer. In the tower of Berkeley Castle, Edward II of England sat in chains, no longer a monarch but a prisoner of his own making. Few rulers in history have inspired such a potent mixture of fascination and revulsion as Edward Plantagenet. He was crowned with all the pageantry England could muster, yet died screaming in a dungeon. He commanded armies but preferred the company of pretty boys. He wore the crown of the conqueror yet lost wars to Scottish farmers with sharpened sticks. Today we enter his story not to judge, but to understand. Because sometimes the truth behind someone history calls weak helps us grasp the terrible weight of power and the price of choosing love over duty. In just moments, you'll discover why Edward II, though despised by medieval England, speaks to modern hearts as a symbol of the eternal struggle between authentic desire and crushing expectation. Picture the Great Hall of Westminster in the year 1307. Tapestries bearing the 3 lions of England hang heavy in the smoky air. At the high table, beneath a canopy of gold cloth, sits a young man barely 23 years old. His hair catches the firelight like spun wheat, his blue eyes hold the brightness of summer skies, and when he laughs, which he does often, the sound rings clear as church bells. This is Edward of Carnarvon, newly crowned Edward II, and in this moment before the storm, he believes the world belongs to him. Beside him, closer than protocol demands, sits a young man whose dark beauty would make angels weep. Piers Gaveston, the Gascon knight who holds the king's heart in hands that were never meant for such precious cargo. The nobles of England watch this scene with growing unease. They see their new king lean close to whisper secrets in a foreign ear, see him bestow titles and lands with the careless generosity of a lovesick boy, see him ignore the weight of kingship for the warmth of forbidden affection. They do not yet know that they are witnessing the first act of a tragedy that will consume an entire realm. Edward had been shaped by fire and disappointment long before he wore the crown. His father, Edward Longshanks, was a giant among medieval kings, a warrior who hammered Scotland into submission and made Wales tremble at the mention of his name. But giants cast long shadows, and in that darkness, young Edward grew up feeling perpetually small. Where his father was steel, Edward was silk. Where Longshanks rode to war with fierce joy, his son preferred the company of minstrels and poets. The old king watched his heir with growing despair, seeing in Edward's gentle nature not kindness but weakness, in his love of beauty not refinement but frivolity. The breaking point came when Edward was 17. His father discovered the prince in a stable, not training with weapons but laughing with a young Gascon squire named Piers Gaveston. They were too close, their intimacy too obvious, their joy too pure for a world that demanded princes love only power and duty. Longshanks exploded with a fury that shook the very stones of the castle. Gaveston was banished immediately, shipped across the sea like a plague that might infect the future king. Edward wept openly, something his father had never seen him do even when bloodied in training. In that moment, the old king realized he had failed to forge his son into the weapon England needed. But love, like water, finds a way through every barrier. The moment Longshanks died and Edward took the throne, one of his first acts was to recall Piers Gaveston from exile. The young king's joy at their reunion was so radiant that even hardened courtiers felt their hearts stir. Here was a love that burned brighter than ambition, purer than politics, more precious than crowns. Edward showered his beloved with honors that made the nobility's blood boil. Gaveston became Earl of Cornwall, a title traditionally reserved for royal blood. He was granted lands and castles worth a king's ransom. Most insulting of all, Edward made him regent of England when the king traveled to France for his wedding. Yes, Edward was to marry Isabella of France, daughter of Philip the Fair, a girl of barely 12 who would become one of history's most formidable queens. But at their wedding, it was Gaveston who wore cloth of gold while the bride's uncles dressed in simple silk. It was Gaveston who sat at the king's right hand while Isabella's family was relegated to lesser seats. The French delegation returned home scandalized, reporting that England's new king cared more for his pretty favorite than his royal bride. They were not wrong. Edward treated his marriage as a diplomatic necessity, but Gaveston as the beating heart of his existence. The English barons watched this spectacle with mounting rage. They had bent the knee to a king, not to his foreign catamite. They saw their ancient privileges ignored while a Gascon upstart accumulated wealth and power. They witnessed their sovereign make a mockery of kingship itself, turning the court into a stage for his impossible romance. But Gaveston was no mere pretty face exploiting an infatuated king. He was witty, charming, and possessed of a razor tongue that could cut courtiers down with a single well-placed insult. He gave the great lords of England mocking nicknames that spread through the kingdom like wildfire. The Earl of Warwick became the Dog, the Earl of Lancaster, the Actor, the Earl of Pembroke, Joseph the Jew. These insults, delivered with Gascon flair and obvious delight, were more than mere rudeness. They were acts of psychological warfare that stripped away the dignity these men considered their birthright. When a foreign favorite could mock English earls with impunity, what did that say about the strength of their king? The answer came sooner than anyone expected. In 1310, just 3 years into Edward's reign, the barons had seen enough. They forced the king to accept the ordinances, a document that stripped away much of his royal authority and demanded Gaveston's permanent exile. The favorite was to leave England forever, on pain of excommunication and death. Edward had no choice but to comply. He watched his beloved sail away across grey waters, knowing that every league between them was a wound that might never heal. For months the king moved through his duties like a ghost, performing the rituals of kingship, while his heart remained across the sea with the man he could not live without. But love makes rebels of us all. Within a year, Edward recalled Gaveston yet again, defying both the barons and the church. Their reunion was passionate, desperate, tinged with the knowledge that they were dancing on the edge of a sword. They stole what happiness they could, knowing that forces greater than their love were gathering like storm clouds on the horizon. The final confrontation came in 1312. The barons, led by the Earl of Warwick, Gaveston's own dog, cornered the favorite at Scarborough Castle. After a brief siege, Gaveston surrendered on promise of safe conduct. It was a promise the earls had no intention of keeping. They dragged Piers Gaveston to Blacklow Hill, a desolate place where winds howled like the voices of the damned. There, without trial or ceremony, they ran him through with swords. The man who had laughed in the face of England's greatest lords died alone, far from the king who loved him, his blood soaking into foreign soil. When news reached Edward, the sound that escaped his throat was barely human. Courtiers who witnessed it said the king aged a decade in that single moment, his golden youth crumbling like autumn leaves. He cradled Gaveston's body when it was returned to him, whispering words of love to ears that could no longer hear, promising revenge that would shake the foundations of his kingdom. The barons had won, but their victory tasted of ashes. They had removed the favorite, but in doing so, they had transformed their weak king into something far more dangerous, a man with nothing left to lose. Edward's grief became a poison that would seep into every corner of his realm, corrupting everything it touched. For a time, it seemed the kingdom might heal. Edward married Isabella properly, and she bore him sons. He appeared to accept the death of his beloved and turn his attention to the duties of kingship. The barons relaxed, believing they had successfully broken their sovereign to their will. They were catastrophically wrong. Edward's apparent submission was merely the calm before a hurricane. In the depths of his grief, he was forging new alliances, new loves, new ways to spite the men who had murdered his heart. The king they thought they had tamed was learning to be truly dangerous. 2 men would come to fill the void left by Gaveston's death, though either could truly replace what had been lost. The first was Hugh Despencer the elder, a seasoned politician who recognized opportunity in the king's isolation. The second was his son, Hugh Despencer the younger, whose ambition burned as brightly as his beauty. Young Despencer was everything Gaveston had been and more: handsome, clever, utterly ruthless in his pursuit of power. But where Gaveston had been content to bask in royal favor, Despencer wanted to wield it like a weapon. He whispered poison in Edward's ear, convincing the grieving king that his enemies deserved destruction, not forgiveness. Under Despencer's influence, Edward began his revenge. One by one, the barons who had murdered Gaveston found themselves stripped of lands, titles, and lives. The Earl of Warwick died mysteriously, some said of poison. Others were driven into exile or executed on trumped-up charges. The king's justice became a blade that cut down anyone who had dared to challenge his love. But revenge is a feast that never satisfies. The more Edward consumed, the hungrier he became. His court transformed from a place of romance to a den of conspiracy and fear. Nobles whispered behind closed doors, wondering who would be next to feel the king's wrath. The realm that had once mocked their sovereign now trembled before him. Isabella, the child bride who had grown into a formidable woman, watched her husband's transformation with growing alarm. She had learned to accept his preference for male companions, had even found ways to work with favorites like Gaveston. But the Despensers were different. They saw her not as an ally but as a threat, a rival for the king's affections and trust. The younger Despenser, in particular, seemed to delight in humiliating the queen. He intercepted her correspondence, restricted her movements, and gradually isolated her from her own supporters. When Isabella protested, Edward sided with his favorite, leaving his wife to realize that she had become a prisoner in her own palace. The breaking point came in 1325. Isabella had been sent to France to negotiate with her brother, King Philip, over disputed territories. It should have been a routine diplomatic mission. Instead, it became the moment when the she-wolf of France was finally unleashed. In Paris, surrounded by the luxury and sophistication of the French court, Isabella saw her marriage and her life with sudden, devastating clarity. She was a queen in name only, wife to a man who would always love others more than her, mother to children who barely knew their father. The Despensers had taken everything from her: her husband's affections, her political influence, even her basic dignity. Standing in the gardens of the Louvre, watching the Seine flow silver in the moonlight, Isabella made a decision that would reshape English history. She would not return to England as Edward's dutiful queen. She would return as his destroyer. The woman who had once been dismissed as a mere broodmare began weaving a conspiracy that would bring down a kingdom. She took a lover, Roger Mortimer, an exiled English baron whose hatred for the Despensers matched her own. Together they began gathering an army of the dispossessed, the ambitious, and the merely desperate. Meanwhile, in England, Edward danced on, oblivious to the storm gathering across the Channel. He held elaborate feasts, showered the Despensers with ever greater honors, and seemed to believe that his queen's extended absence was merely a diplomatic necessity. The man who had once wept so bitterly for a murdered lover had become incapable of recognizing when another love was dying. The invasion came in September 1326. Isabella landed with a small force, but England rose to meet her like a nation desperate for salvation. Nobles who had cowered before Edward's revenge joined her banner. Cities opened their gates to her army. Common folk cheered her passage, seeing in the angry queen their deliverance from tyranny. Edward, suddenly confronted with the collapse of his reign, could barely comprehend what was happening. The kingdom he thought he controlled was melting away like snow in summer. Even the Despensers, for all their power and cunning, found themselves abandoned by allies who smelled the changing wind. The end came swiftly. Hugh Despenser the Elder was captured and executed, his head mounted on a spike for the crowds to mock. His son lasted longer, fleeing with the king through Wales, but eventually, they too were cornered. Young Despenser was dragged to Hereford, where Isabella herself presided over his destruction. The queen who had been dismissed and humiliated now held the power of life and death over her husband's favorite. The execution was brutal even by medieval standards. Despenser was castrated, disemboweled, and quartered while still alive, his screams echoing across the marketplace. Isabella watched it all with eyes like winter ice, finally claiming the revenge that had sustained her 3 years of humiliation. Edward himself was taken to Kenilworth Castle, where he was forced to abdicate in favor of his 14-year-old son. The man who had once believed himself divinely appointed to rule England now knelt before his wife and begged for mercy. Isabella granted him his life, but nothing more. The crown that had been won with such pageantry was surrendered with tears and shame. But mercy, as Edward would learn, could be more terrible than justice. Hidden away in Berkeley Castle, the former king discovered that survival without dignity was its own form of death. His captors subjected him to deliberate humiliation, forced to shave with dirty water, fed scraps like a dog, made to sleep in filth while his guards jeered at the fall of the great king. Yet even in this degradation, Edward found a strange kind of peace. Stripped of crown and power, no longer responsible for the fate of kingdoms, he was finally free to be simply human. He spoke kindly to his jailers, shared what little food he had with prisoners in neighboring cells, and spent long hours in prayer for the souls of those he had loved and lost. It was almost as if the terrible weight of kingship had been a burden he was grateful to set down. The man who had never wanted to be a warrior king, who had preferred poetry to politics and love to power, could finally stop pretending to be something he was never meant to be. In his cell, Edward of Carnarvon found the authenticity that had eluded Edward II. But Isabella and Mortimer could not allow him this peace. A living former king, no matter how broken, remained a potential rallying point for rebellion. As long as Edward breathed, his son's crown would never be truly secure. The order went out. Disguised as concern for the prisoner's health, the former king was to be moved to more secure quarters. On the night of September 21, 1327, screams echoed from the tower of Berkeley Castle that would haunt witnesses for the rest of their lives. In the morning, Edward II was found dead in his cell, his face twisted in agony, his body bearing no external wounds. The official cause was given as natural illness, but everyone knew the truth. The king who had loved too openly, too honestly, too completely for the brutal world of medieval politics had finally been silenced. His last words, according to one chronicler, were a prayer for Piers Gaveston's soul, the love that had defined and destroyed his reign remaining with him until the very end. Thus ended the reign of Edward II, a king who was neither warrior nor statesman, either conqueror nor saint, but simply a man who dared to love in a world that demanded he hate. His story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of weakness, the price of defying convention, the fate that awaits those who choose heart over crown. But perhaps there is another lesson in Edward's tragedy. Perhaps his real crime was not weakness but honesty, the terrible honesty of refusing to pretend that duty mattered more than love, that crowns were worth more than hearts, that the expectations of others should outweigh the truth of one's own soul. In our own age, when the battle between authentic identity and social expectation still rages in every human heart, Edward II speaks to us across the centuries. His screams in that cold castle tower echo our own fears of what it costs to be truly ourselves in a world that demands conformity. History called him the weakest of England's kings, but perhaps that weakness was really a different kind of strength, the strength to love without reservation, to grieve without shame, to remain human despite wearing a crown that demanded he become something else entirely. The screams that echoed from Berkeley Castle on that September night in 1327 marked more than the death of a king. They announced the birth of a legend that would haunt England for centuries. But legends, like shadows, often obscure the truth they claim to preserve. Who was Edward II, really? The monster chroniclers painted, or the martyred lover modern hearts embrace? In the dusty archives of medieval monasteries, monks wrote their version of Edward's story with ink still bitter from righteous indignation. To them, he was God's punishment upon England, a sodomite king who chose lust over duty and brought divine wrath upon his realm. They recorded his failures with relish, the lost battles, the murdered favorites, the kingdom brought to ruin by unnatural love. Brother Thomas of Canterbury wrote, "The king loved not as a man should love, but as beasts in the field, bringing shame upon the crown of England." Such was the verdict of an age that saw Edward's greatest crime not in his political failures, but in his refusal to hide his heart behind the mask of kingship. Yet even these hostile chroniclers could not entirely suppress the humanity that flickered beneath their condemnation. They recorded moments of unexpected tenderness, Edward comforting a crying child, sharing his meal with starving peasants, weeping openly when told of a knight's death in battle. These glimpses of genuine emotion, scattered through pages of moral outrage, reveal a man whose capacity for love extended far beyond the bedroom. The truth about Edward's sexuality, so scandalous to medieval minds, appears less shocking when viewed through the lens of human nature rather than religious doctrine. Here was a man who loved deeply, completely, without the careful calculations that usually governed royal affections. Whether his relationships were physical, emotional, or both mattered less than their authenticity in a world built on performance and pretense. Piers Gaveston, the great love of Edward's life, emerges from contemporary accounts as more than the scheming favorite of popular imagination. Letters between the two men, preserved in the Tower of London, reveal a relationship of genuine intimacy and mutual respect. "My dearest brother," Edward wrote, "your absence is winter to my soul." Such words, penned by a king to a knight, speak of love that transcended the boundaries of rank and nation. The barons who murdered Gaveston believed they were saving England from corruption. In reality, they were destroying the one person who might have moderated Edward's worst impulses. With his beloved dead, the king's capacity for mercy died too, replaced by a thirst for revenge that would consume his reign and ultimately his life. The dispensers who followed were symptoms, not causes, of Edward's transformation. Hugh the Younger, in particular, understood that the grieving king wanted not just comfort but validation of his rage. Where Gaveston had whispered words of love, Dispenser whispered words of hate, turning Edward's broken heart into a weapon against his enemies. Under Dispenser's influence, Edward became everything his critics claimed he had always been: cruel, vindictive, utterly consumed by personal passion at the expense of political wisdom. The gentle prince who had once wept over wounded animals now watched his enemies die with satisfaction. Love's absence had created something far more dangerous than love's presence had ever been. Isabella's rebellion was not merely the revolt of a scorned wife, it was the uprising of a woman who had watched her husband's soul decay and her kingdom crumble. The French princess who had arrived in England as a 12-year-old bride had grown into a queen of formidable intelligence and ruthless pragmatism. She understood what Edward never could, that monarchy was performance, and he had forgotten his lines. Her alliance with Roger Mortimer was born of necessity, not passion, though contemporary chroniclers delighted in painting it as a love affair to match Edward's own scandals. The truth was more complex. Isabella needed Mortimer's military expertise and network of exiled nobles, while he needed her legitimacy and French connections. Their partnership was built on mutual benefit, not mutual attraction. The invasion of 1326 succeeded not because Isabella's forces were strong, but because Edward's support had completely evaporated. Years of erratic rule, economic mismanagement, and military defeat had left him friendless in his own kingdom. When the Queen landed with her small army, England welcomed her not as a conqueror but as a liberator. The speed of Edward's collapse revealed how hollow his authority had become. Nobles who had trembled before the dispensers abandoned them without a second thought. Cities that had paid crushing taxes to fund royal favorites opened their gates to the invading queen. Even the common people, normally indifferent to the struggles of their betters, cheered Isabella's progress through their villages. Edward's flight through Wales with young Dispenser was less a strategic retreat than a desperate attempt to deny reality. The king who had once commanded armies now traveled like a fugitive, dependent on the loyalty of a handful of retainers who stayed more from habit than conviction. When capture finally came, it almost seemed like relief. The terrible burden of maintaining his crumbling reign could finally be set aside. The execution of Hugh Dispenser the Younger was Isabella's masterpiece of political theatre. By presiding over the death of Edward's last favorite, she demonstrated that the old order was truly dead. The brutal nature of Dispenser's end castration, disembowelment, quartering was intended not just as punishment but as symbolic reversal of the sexual corruption he represented. Yet even in orchestrating this savage revenge, Isabella showed flashes of the mercy that had once made her beloved by the English people. She allowed Edward to keep a small household in captivity, permitted him to hear Mass daily, and ensured he received adequate food and clothing. Her hatred was reserved for his favorites, not the broken man himself. Edward's abdication was perhaps the most human moment of his entire reign. Stripped of ceremony and surrounded by enemies, he wept as he surrendered the crown that had brought him nothing but misery. His final words as king were reportedly an apology not to England for his failures as a ruler, but to his son for the inheritance of chaos he was leaving behind. In captivity at Kenilworth and later Berkeley Castle, Edward discovered a peace that had eluded him throughout his reign. Freed from the impossible demands of kingship, he could finally be simply human. Guards later testified that the former king was gentle, pious, and genuinely concerned for the welfare of his fellow prisoners. The man who had been unable to rule England successfully proved quite capable of ruling himself. This transformation makes his eventual murder all the more tragic. Just as Edward was finding some measure of contentment in obscurity, the political necessities of his situation made his continued existence impossible. Isabella and Mortimer, whatever their personal feelings, could not allow a living former king to become a focal point for rebellion against the new regime. The method of Edward's death traditionally described as a red-hot poker thrust into his bowels, though this may be later propaganda, was chosen to send a message about the fate awaiting those who challenge conventional sexuality. Whether this specific detail is accurate or not, the symbolism was unmistakable. The king who had loved men would die in a manner that mocked that love. Yet even in death, Edward confounded his enemies' attempts to control his legacy. Instead of becoming a cautionary tale about divine punishment for unnatural behavior, he became something far more dangerous, a martyr to authentic love in a world that demanded dissimulation. His story inspired not horror but sympathy, not condemnation but understanding. The immediate aftermath of Edward's death revealed how completely his enemies had miscalculated. Rather than strengthening young Edward III's position, it created a martyr whose memory would haunt the new regime. Pilgrims began visiting Edward's tomb, praying for his intercession and claiming miraculous healings. The weak king in death proved more powerful than he had ever been in life. Isabella and Mortimer's triumph was brief. Within 3 years, Edward III had overthrown his mother's lover and assumed personal rule. One of his first acts was to honor his father's memory, commissioning a magnificent tomb that drew thousands of visitors. The son understood what the mother had not, that destroying Edward's reputation was less important than reclaiming his dynasty's honor. Medieval chroniclers struggled to make sense of Edward's story. Their religious worldview demanded that his failures be punishment for sin, yet the genuine affection he inspired even from enemies suggested divine favor rather than condemnation. This contradiction led to increasingly elaborate explanations. Perhaps Edward was being tested like Job, or perhaps his sufferings were penance for ancestral sins. Modern historians have been no less confused by Edward's legacy. Those seeking to claim him as an early champion of sexual liberation run up against his manifest failures as a ruler. Those dismissing him as merely incompetent cannot explain the passionate loyalty he inspired in his favorites, or the genuine grief expressed at his death, even by political opponents. The truth is that Edward II was neither saint nor monster, but something more complex and ultimately more human, a man who refused to separate his public and private selves, who loved without calculation, and who paid the ultimate price for authenticity in a world that prized performance above truth. His relationship with Piers Gaveston, whatever its exact nature, represented something revolutionary in medieval politics: genuine emotional intimacy between men of power. In an age when marriages were political contracts and friendships were strategic alliances, Edward dared to love simply because he loved, without reference to advantage or propriety. This authenticity, so attractive to modern sensibilities, was precisely what made Edward impossible as a medieval king. Monarchy in the 14th century was an elaborate performance designed to project strength, wisdom, and divine approval. Edward's transparent emotions, his obvious preferences, his inability to dissemble effectively all undermined the mystique that made royal authority possible. The tragedy of Edward II was not that he was homosexual. Many medieval kings had male lovers without losing their thrones. His tragedy was that he could not keep his private nature separate from his public role, could not perform kingship while living as himself. In trying to be both authentic and royal, he succeeded at neither. Yet this failure contains its own form of heroism. In choosing love over duty, emotion over calculation, authenticity over performance, Edward challenged the very foundations of medieval monarchy. His reign may have been a political disaster, but it was also a declaration of human dignity that resonates across the centuries. The screams from Berkeley Castle that September night were not just the death cries of a failed king, they were the birth pangs of a new understanding of what it means to be human in power. Edward II died so that future generations might live more authentically, love more openly, and rule with greater humanity. Standing today in Gloucester Cathedral, where Edward's tomb draws visitors from around the world, we can still feel the power of his story. Here lies a king who chose to be himself rather than what others demanded, who loved without reservation in a world that counseled moderation, who died for the crime of authenticity in an age of masks. His epitaph might read, "Here lies Edward, who dared to be human while wearing a crown." In our own time, when the tension between public performance and private truth remains as sharp as ever, his story continues to speak to hearts that understand the price of being genuinely yourself in a world that often demands you be someone else. Monster or martyr? The question misses the point entirely. Edward II was simply a man flawed, loving, authentic, and ultimately victorious in ways his enemies never imagined. His crown was broken, but his humanity remained intact. In the end, that may be the only victory that truly matters. If this story moved you, reflect on moments when you've chosen authenticity over expectation, love over advantage, truth over performance. Edward's legacy lives not in the chronicles of kings but in the hearts of all who dare to love openly in a world that often demands we love in secret. The crown may be broken, but the heart it sought to contain beats on, eternal and free.